and new ones join the club this morning. I'm Sarah North, and I will be hosting today's event and standing in for Liz as she's unable to make this morning's breakfast club. And a big warm welcome to Jan Hills and Lindsay Hanson, who are going to talk about neuroscience and interviewing. Before we just go ahead, I know we've lost a few minutes, but there's just a few little bits of housekeeping. We will be sending out the slides, any articles and recordings by the end of the week so that you can revisit and share with your colleagues. And throughout the event, we will be tweeting using hashtag #BrainSavvy, so please join in the conversation. We'll be running for about 45 minutes. The main event's only 30 minutes, so please use the chat box throughout. I'm sure Jan's going to keep you engaged with lots of polls and questions. However, there will be time for questions at the end, so if you think of some questions as we're going along, please save those to the end. But, obviously type as you're going along as well, so we'll do both. And the chat box won't be visible on the recording, so please feel free to be engaging as honest as you like. If you struggle with the audio at any time, you can dial into the platform, and I'm just going to move that number across so you can see. And so now I'm going to hand you over to Jan, and I'll catch up with you all at the end. So welcome, Jan, and over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the people who've been on these webinars before. Today we're looking at the neuroscience of interviewing, and hopefully you'll find this insightful. Kind of ironic Liz couldn't be here because we actually did this webinar specifically for Liz and her company Shorebird RPO. So any clients of Liz, welcome to the Breakfast Club webinar. Just a quick word about Head, Heart and Brain. We know it's a quirky name. Those of you who don't know us, we work in leadership development. We also do quite a lot of work in HR policy and practice, looking at what neuroscience can add to how leaders lead and how HR are more effective in the business. So what we're going to cover today, and excuse the typo on this slide, so these are framed as questions really, as almost interview questions. So we're going to take a look at your approach to hiring and growth and fixed mindset that some of you may have come across on other webinars we've run. We're going to look at what happens in the brain when people are under stress in an interview, and also what happens in your brain as an interviewer, and the threats or rewards that you get. And then finally we'll have a quick look at a few points on bias. But let's start off with a poll. So, Sarah, can we put this poll in? So we're going to have a look here, so please vote on what you're looking for in candidates. So are you looking for potential, someone who will grow into the job, or are you looking for someone who's already done that type of work before and comes, ready to hit the ground running, or a bit of both? So, okay, so most people saying a bit of both. A few people now saying they're looking for potential. Oh, our potential people have gone away, changed their minds. Okay, so most people looking for a bit of both. And what would be interesting, and we haven't really asked this question here, is how explicit are you as an interview panel or interview team about the weighting of that, so experience over potential. And the reason we ask that question, can we get rid of this please, Sarah, is what mindset we have, whether we're looking for potential or looking for someone who's already done the job, will determine the types of questions we ask, but also the way the candidate actually answers our questions. So if someone thinks you're looking for someone who's already done the job, and they're going to focus much more on talking about their qualities and why they're the right person for the job, and may cover up or not raise to your attention things that have gone wrong, because people with what Carol Dweck, who's done this research, describes as a fixed mindset, will be much more motivated and actually quite concerned about letting you hear about any evidence that may suggest they're not the perfect candidate. Whereas, in contrast, someone with what Carol Dweck calls as a growth mindset is much more likely to talk to you about things that have gone wrong and what they've learned from it, things they've learned on the job, role models that they follow and that they're, again, learning from. And those two things will sound very different to you in the interview process. And if you're not clear about which of those is most important, it's easy to dismiss people with a growth mindset as people who haven't really demonstrated some of their qualities. So worth thinking about that and how that might be influencing what you hear from a candidate. And if you're interested in Carol Dweck's work, there's some articles on our website, which Lindsay has now put into the chat box here, that you can follow up on. So my second poll is, how stressful do you think your interviews are for the candidate? So if we get this poll up, how stressful do you think it is to come and be interviewed by you or in your company?
Coming over.
Okay, thank you. So do you think it's very stressful? You wouldn't like to be doing it yourself? You're happy to be on the interviewing end, moderately or not at all? So most people are saying moderately. Some interesting work by a lady called Jessica Payne from the University of Notre Dame in the States has found that people perform at their best when they're under mild stress, they're in a good mood, and they've had plenty of sleep. Obviously, there's not very much you can do about the amount of sleep your candidates have, but remembering that the interview situation is probably stressful as it is, and you don't really need to add additional stress to that situation for a candidate. And the reason why this is important is when we're experiencing a lot of stress, the prefrontal cortex part of our brain, the brain that deals with our rational, logical thinking, a lot of what you're probably testing in an interview, tends to, when we're very stressed, close down. That's when you get that feeling of going blank. And for an interview candidate, that might well be where they struggle to think of an example to a question or to articulate their answer very clearly. That's the emotional limbic part of the brain taking all the energy, because in a stressful situation, it's acting as if it has to fight or flight. So, the point here is, think about your interview candidates, put yourself in their shoes. If you want to actually get a response on how they operate under normal working conditions, you probably don't want to stress them any more than what's going to be happening in the interview anyway. And you don't want their amygdala taking over their prefrontal cortex. You'll be missing a lot of good information and good examples that they may have for you. And this is Related to that, this is a model that we use called the CORE model, and some of you may have come across this before. So CORE looks at how the brain responds in an unconscious way, but in a way that we can bring to conscious awareness in either a threat or a reward situation. So what we've just described there is when a threat situation happens, what happens to the brain. So the prefrontal cortex becomes compromised, it's working less well, and the limbic brain, what's responsible for our emotional response to things, as well as other things, takes over. And what CORE stands for is the main areas where that either threat or reward response tends to happen. So that's uncertainty, options, reputation, and equity. And if we put this into an interview context, as the interviewer, you probably experience a reward for certainty because you know how long the interview is going to last, what you're seeking to understand from the candidates in the interview. You're probably sure about the questions you want to answer, you want answered, and even what types of answers you're looking for. In contrast, the candidate is probably in the dark about most of those things and experiencing a threat response, wondering, you know, what you want to hear, how long the interview is going to last, how long different parts of the interview are going to take. So one thing you can do to help the candidate be less stressed in the interview is give them more of a sense of certainty about what's going on. You know, and obviously this is good practice anyway, but we sometimes forget to do this. So, you know, even little things make a big difference. So even telling the candidate how long the interview is going to last, what the different phases of the interview process are going to be, the types of questions you're going to ask them, and even the criteria that you're looking for can all help the candidate reduce the level of threat for certainty and increase the sense of reward. Options is the other one. Again, as the interviewer, you're probably getting a sense of reward on options. You can pick and choose the way in which you go about the process. And I think the other big one here for both the candidates and yourself is reputation. So in an interview situation, the interviewer is definitely getting a reward to their sense of reputation. They're in the driving seat, and they hold a higher status, if you like, in the interview process. So anything you can do to help the candidate enhance their sense of reputation, even little things like complimenting them on their degree, for example, if they're a graduate, or a project that they've achieved something, or even little things like, you know, getting to the interview and finding their way can all help people to mitigate some of that sense of threat because they're in a, you know, a lesser situation than the interviewer. And I think this is particularly important where you've got things like panel interviews, where you want to really try and help people to feel less of a sense of threat and more an equilibrium. So anything the panel can do to appear warm and friendly helps people to mitigate that sense. So if people have got questions about any of these things, please feel free to type them into the chat box, and we'll try and answer them as we go along. So the other area we wanted to talk about in this, so, you know, it is the whole area of bias. And obviously bias is something that we know about in interviewing. And one of the most common ways in which people talk about bias is that, you know, halo and horns. So you get a gut feel about a candidate within the first people talk about 4 seconds of meeting them. The reality is that we actually categorize people in a much shorter time than that, in a fraction of a second. And this is an old response in our brain where we're basically categorizing people as friend or foe. So back in the days, in an evolutionary time, what we were doing was categorizing, is this person, a potential danger to me, or am I superior to this person and would be able to kind of fight them if I needed to, for example. But that mechanism still operates. So within, a very short period of time of meeting someone, that categorization is happening. And ideally, you can't stop it, but ideally what you want to do is try and mitigate it. So notice the gut reaction that you have, and then if you can, put it to one side. But we have a think here about how difficult that can sometimes be and why. So the other reason we have bias is that we have different ways of our brain processing information. And this is the work of Daniel Kahneman that you may have seen in Thinking Fast and Slow. So he talks about System 1 and System 2. So part of our brain works very, very quickly and makes those gut reactions, those quick decisions about what's right and what's wrong, what's the answer and what isn't. And that's very useful to us because it means we can process much more data more quickly. However, those things can also be mental shortcuts. So they happen in a nanosecond and we make a decision to do something before we've really taken time to check out with our logical, rational brain whether that's the right thing. So some people say there are something like 150 biases that happen in this because of this quick and automatic brain. And we're not going to cover all of them, obviously, here, but we are going to try and cover some of the ones that happen most frequently in an interview situation. So maybe the first one to think about is confirmation bias in an interview situation. So confirmation bias is where that first impression that we have of the candidate, we start to filter everything else we hear and see to confirm our initial impression. And so, for example, if the candidate comes in dressed in a similar way to you, or they answer their first question in a way that completely meets your question criteria, you may then start filtering everything else they say to notice the things that meet your first impression. And I don't know, let's see what people say in the chat box. How much are people aware that this is one of the biases that can happen with your interviews or your interview panels? We've got Peter here with a question. I aim to interview and to have a conversation using behavioral-based interview techniques. Makes that a challenge as you easily end up firing off many questions. Yeah, and in a sense that can also create that threat response, particularly if the candidate feels that they don't have any options about how, about what those questions are and what you're really looking for. So, one way of dealing with that is interspersing your questions with questions that the candidate may also have, and giving them a chance to also explore a bit about why you're asking those questions will give them much more sense of certainty and some options. So going back to our bias, the other one to look out for, which can feel quite similar, is false consensus bias. And what this bias is about is that when we believe something, so we believe that it's right for people to dress up for an interview, for example, or we believe that people who went to a certain university are going to have the right qualities for our organization, and particularly when we know something, we tend to believe that other people also know that, particularly if they are similar to us. So if we've already decided someone is similar to us, they wear the same sort of clothes, they have the same sort of interests, they went to the same university or did the same course, or they've worked in another company where we've worked, with that again can make us filter things, and we start to make illogical jumps that because they're similar to us in some ways, they're similar to us in many other ways. So for example, we might make the jump that they will like doing the same sort of job we like doing, or they do it in the same sort of way as we do it. And that's not logically the case, but false consensus bias drives us in that way. And Matt Lieberman, who's a neuroscientist at UCLA in the States, has found that something like only 2% of what we know, only about 2% of other people probably feel the same way, but we tend to believe that people who we've already categorized as like us will like the same things that we do. And again, Peter's got an interesting comment here. The first interview by phone helps me to at least reduce some of the biases. That's quite interesting, I guess, because, Peter, what you're saying there is you're not categorizing people in quite the same way because you haven't got that visual image of them. Quite interesting way of thinking about this. And again, we've got Lou saying that their interview structure is also very questions-based. And I think an interview structure will be very questions-based, and that's not necessarily an issue. It's the way you use those questions and the amount of guidance you give the interviewee about how they can get involved in the interview process and how you can give them a sense of certainty, give them some options, and enhance their sense of reputation. And then we've got Tessa asking here, what's your view on video interviews, that they're pre-recorded by the candidate? Interesting. Well, I think they suffer from some of these biases because you've got the visual thing again, but I guess you've given them some options about how they do that interview, and maybe even you've given them some options about what they are going to discuss there, although I suspect you have a framework of things you want them to cover. And then we've got a comment that consistency in the actual questions between candidates helps. It does help with unconscious bias if, and this is a really important point here, if you don't share those results and opinions during the selection process. So if you wait to the end so that the interviewers are not being biased by each other. And then we've got Sarah talking about the use of psychometrics to increase interviews' level of objective analysis. Again, yes, if you keep that data to the end and assess it all together at the same time, rather than sharing those psychometrics during the process, which again can create that confirmation bias. Oh, this person is, emotional, has a tendency to prefer big picture to small picture, those sorts of things can perpetuate some of these biases. The other bias, which is an important one, is negativity bias. Our brain is actually set up to notice threat, and so anything that's negative will tend to be processed by the brain as a threat. And the issue with that is that if a candidate starts telling you something that went wrong, for example, you can give that information more weighting than some of the positive things that have happened. So, you know, the example might be the candidate who tells you about something that went wrong when they were at university, for example, maybe a module they failed or had to retake, and that small piece of negative information biases all the good things they've done for the next 10 years in their working life. So, and you hear that when you hear interviewers say things like, you know, this candidate's got great experience, they've really got the potential to do the role we want them to do, but I'm worried about that module they failed 10 years ago at university. That would be an example of us giving undue weight to negativity, and that's a natural way that our brain responds, but one that we need to kind of try and overcome in the interview process. And then one of the other biases, which is, I think, very relevant to interviewing, but helps, as Peter says, when you're doing at least first interviews by phone, if you can't see people, is the physical attractiveness bias. So lots and lots of research that says people who are physically more attractive, especially people, for example, men who are taller and good-looking, and women who are deemed to kind of be attractive and well-dressed, we tend to equate that with other desirable personality characteristics. So things like we assume that because they're attractive and well-dressed, they're also energetic, that they work hard, and that they're successful in other ways. Of course, none of this is logical, but this is, again, a shortcut that our brain uses. And there's lots and lots of examples of organizations that try to overcome this by doing blind recruitment, less in the business sense, but more like things like orchestras who will hold auditions blind, so that what the kind of the player looks like is not influencing the decision of the producers or the orchestra leader. And Lindsay's put up a link here. If you're interested in bias more generally, there's an article on our website that also looks at this, looks at biases through the lens of diversity as well. So any comments on things that people are doing to avoid bias in their organizations? So some of the things we see are people taking off the names of candidates, particularly if those names have kind of ethnic connotations, so that people are avoiding bias there. We've got the example here of phone interviews can help some of this, particularly the physical attractiveness one. Okay, so Michelle's saying she can't get any of the links to work. Very strange. Lindsay, could you just maybe go and check the website, that we haven't got some coincidental thing happening with that? Okay. The other thing that can help bias is to really look carefully at the structure of your process. So one of the things we mentioned earlier is making sure that people who are part of the interview process don't confer during the process, but you save all your data to the end, so it all gets equal weighting, and people aren't influencing each other, so they aren't setting up their own biases. And people here are saying the links are working for them. So, Michelle, sorry if that's not working for you. Maybe try again, or if not, I'll send you the links later. And then we've got Tessa saying, I tried to use interviews minimally and rely on assessment exercises instead. Save interviews for selling the organisation. Okay, so interesting. Although some of these biases, of course, can still be relevant in an assessment process. So let's have a poll here. How brain savvy do you think your interviews are? So by that I mean, how much are you avoiding threat against the core model, and how much are you avoiding biases in your interview process? We've got about 60% of people saying that they think their process is moderately brain savvy. That's pretty good. That's really good. I'd be really interested to say for people to say into the chat box which you think are the things you're doing the best at. So is it reducing threat? Is it reducing bias? Is it making sure that candidates aren't too stressed out? Michelle, if you go to our website and put in bias, that article will come up rather than have to kind of go through a whole long Google list. And our website's www.headheartbrain.com. Okay, so we've got Carol saying reducing threat, about 2 or 3 people saying reducing threat. And we've got Lynn saying they've recently trained managers in unconscious bias to raise awareness. Yeah, there's evidence that training does raise awareness and does make people more conscious of the biases. Because they happen at an unconscious level, it can't completely stop them. So having that, what we call a kind of OD process in your recruitment, where you're checking each other, is still needed, but training's a good start. Oh, a really interesting one from Tessa here. Treating candidates as clients and educating interviewers about bias. Yeah, we did some work a year or so ago for a big retailer where one of their motivations for improving their recruiting process was because they recognized that the candidates that they actually didn't take were also their customers. So really worth thinking about from the candidate's point of view, what's the impression your organization's creating. And then we've got Dave saying better at reducing stress and bias. Well, that's a really good start. If you're interested in bias, and particularly if you're interested in what your own biases may be, Lindsay's just put up here the implicit association test, which is a test by Harvard University that looks at what our own biases are, and it's really, really interesting to take. And a little warning, it kind of brings you up short about some of your own biases that you may not have been aware of. Yeah, and Lindsay mentioning that the retailer we worked with also designed their process to look for people with a growth mindset. And we're increasingly seeing that with organizations, a recognition that with the amount of change going on in the world at the moment, unless you've got candidates who have a growth mindset, who are always looking to improve what they can already do, those people are going to have a limited career in most companies. And we've got Peter saying he did the Harvard test and he'd recommend it. It was an eye-opener. Good for you, Peter. Well done. Yeah, and other people saying they've done the test as well. And, you know, if you're not explicitly training your managers in unconscious bias, encouraging your interviewers to do that test is one way of really increasing people's consciousness and awareness of this. So in the last kind of 5 minutes or so, and I'll answer your questions or comments as they come up, what can you do to make your interview process more brain savvy? So first of all, understand your recruitment principles. Are you primarily looking for a fixed or growth mindset? And what's the balance that you're looking for there? And the natural tendency in most organizations will be to go for the easy option and look for people who've already done the same type of job and have the same type of experience. But for the longer term, you might want to make sure that you've got people who have a growth mindset, who are going to grow and change as your organization changes. A structured process, particularly a structured interview process, is shown to be much more reliable, particularly if you keep the opinions of the different interviewers in the process to the end, so they're not biasing each other throughout. Make the interview warm and friendly. You're testing people's ability or their potential, not their resilience, and just be mindful of the impact that stress can have on a candidate's ability to answer questions that in a more relaxed state they might answer really easily. Train your interviewers, train them both in being brain savvy, so the impact of stress and the core model, and also in bias. And then cross-reference your ratings and views on a candidate at the end of the process. And make sure that is calibrated and facilitated so that the more kind of noisy interviewers, if you like, the people who have the strongest opinions, again, aren't biasing the rest of the interview panel or the interview team. So that's what we had to say. We've got 2 minutes before the end of our webinar. So anyone who's got any questions in those last couple of minutes, please type them into the chat box. Just to tell you a little bit about what will happen from here, we have been recording this, so we will make that recording available to everybody who registered for the webinar. And there's also an article actually written by my colleague Lindsay Hanson, who's been helping me out here, on brain savvy interviewing, that will go up onto our website today that you can access. In fact, it may already be up on our website. So if you want a summary of what we've talked about today and a little bit more detail and links to the various bits of research we've mentioned, then that will be a good source for you. And just a few last comments here. People saying they're trying to get candidates to relax. And to try and balance out so you've got time to cover all the points, and also not to forget that some people have had a hard day when they come for the interview. Yeah, that's another really good point, I think. And then Tessa's asking, what's the least biased recruitment tool in your opinion? I guess, Tessa, in my opinion, it's not that, I don't think there's one recruitment tool that's least biased. I think it's about you managing your whole process. So right from your interviewers being aware, right through to how you calibrate the data that you've got, because any tool that you use has the potential to be biased. It's how you use it. And then we've got Jackie asking, does anyone use photographs of candidates as a memory jogger? I think that's quite a common process these days. All I'd say is watch out for physical attractiveness bias if you're doing that, and people who are not as photogenic as others. So our time is up. Thank you very much for your input and for joining this webinar, and look forward to you joining future sessions. You can learn more about Brain Savvy HR from our book, which is available on Amazon. As I mentioned, there's an article on our website. And our next Breakfast Club is on neuroscience motivation and reward policies, and that's the 5th of May. So please join us then, and you might want to pass those details on to any of your reward colleagues. And the one after that will be about improving engagement. So thanks again. Really great to talk to you this morning. I'm sorry about some of the earlier issues with the audio. Have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.